Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this seminar. Before we start, I just want to make a comment. And this event, whilst the speakers are speaking, is online. It's live streaming, and it will appear on YouTube. And after the speakers have completed their inputs, we will have Chatham House rules for a discussion with all of you. Thank you very much. First of all, I need to share with you the apologies for Mr. Bum, who until yesterday evening was going to join us this morning. However, and he sends his apologies, Dr. Linda Darkwa, who's sitting on my left, and you've got the bios of them, will stand in for Dr. Bum, of Mr. Bum, and Mr. Bum shared his views and notes with Dr. Darkwa. So we appreciate Dr. Darkwa being here with us. On behalf of the ISS, I would like to welcome each and everybody for accepting our invitation to this unique opportunity to think outside the box and listen to these speakers who are trying to assist us and themselves to make mind shifts for practical implication of the APSA-AGA synergies and challenges. This is important because both the instruments are related to democratic governance, peace and security. And you will hear the views of the different speakers on it. ISS wants to thank NUPI specifically, who through the Training for Peace program, which is sponsored by the government of Norway for more than 20 years, and of which ISS is also a partner, who commissioned this research undertaken by Dr. George Mukundi, and NUPI launched the report in Oslo the day before yesterday. So it's fresh off the press and it's available online. It will not be available in printed format except if you print it yourself. We also want to thank the government of Denmark, and we also want to thank the government of United Kingdom through its DFID project, who contributed to these efforts over the last 2 days. Last but not least, the ISS would like to thank you for attending this event, and we really trust that your inputs and questions and comments will help us to further develop the challenges that are faced by AGA and APSA. What we've put on your chairs are different documents that are self-explaining, but there's one document that yesterday during the closed round table we wrote down 4 expectations for the group that attended the round table. But you can go through those expectations, because this is work in progress and work that needs to be addressed in the future. This is not an event that stops. This is the start of a new beginning, of creative thinking. So on that note, I would like to welcome all of you and say that the report by Dr. George Mukundi couldn't have come at a timelier moment. The report is related to and speaks to the reforms taking place at the AU and also at the United Nations. We had participants from the United Nations here yesterday as well. They are going through these same reform processes. So it's a very interesting debate, and George was the former head of AGA, so he has in-depth knowledge of the functioning of AGA. On that note, I would just like to share with you the order in which the speakers will speak. We will first look at the AU perspective on AGA APSA, and we will have Dr. Sergio Bar, and you've got his bio in front of you. Then Rahimat Mamadou. Then George Mukundi and Dr. Linda Darkwa, in that order. After they've spoken, we will enter into the session for discussion. Thank you. Sergio.
Thank you, Annette, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be back here in Pretoria after several years to reflect and enter into some form of deliberation with the gathered guests here on the African peace and security architecture and the AGA. For those of you who were here yesterday, if I sound like a broken record, well, it's because you were here yesterday. And so you'll have to bear with me. But I think as a starting point for us, the APSA and the AGA are essentially identical twins. Governance, peace, security, and stability on the continent are inseparable. And at the level of the African Union, whilst these two architectures are housed in two different departments, the reality is that the end state, with respect to what we really want to accomplish with these two instruments, is driving us towards the efforts of silencing the guns by 2020. You will recall that the Assembly took a decision, which is essentially our mandate, to say we as African Union, working with member states, working with the regional economic communities, would have to ensure that by 2020 the guns are silenced. And I think there are several initiatives in this direction. Some people might think that it's overly ambitious to think that you can silence the guns in the next 3 years, but I don't see anything wrong with being ambitious. You can fall short of your ambitions, and then you make an assessment and see how you can achieve the desired objective that you've set for yourself. I would just want to reflect on several elements with respect to the African peace and security architecture. You may be aware that the roadmap for the APSA, which was initiated in 2016 for a 5-year period, 2016 to 2020, has 5 strategic priority areas. The first one is conflict prevention. The second is crisis management. The third is PCRD and peace building. The fourth one is strategic security issues. And the fifth one is coordination and partnerships. And when we say partnerships, partnerships with the regional economic communities, partnerships with multilateral institutions, including the international financial institutions, but also partnerships with African civil society in its broadest sense. With regards to the day-to-day management of the APSA, I am responsible for what we call the Crisis Management and Post-Conflict and Reconstruction Division. So we essentially oversee all crisis situations on the African continent with respect to managing them, and part of that management is how do we ensure that where we've made significant progress, we don't experience relapse. So our post-conflict reconstruction engagements are geared towards driving at processes that will lead to transformation in conflicts that have emerged from conflicts or that are going through difficult transitions. There are 6 pillars of the AU PCRD policy. I will bore you and I will repeat those. The first one is humanitarian and emergency assistance. The second one is political governance and transition. The third one is human rights, justice, and reconciliation. The fourth is women, youth, and gender. I know at times the women don't like it when you put the women and youth, then they will say, well, we still have some ways to go because we women have to be a standalone, so I think I'll put women separately so I don't run into any challenges with anyone in the room. So it will be women, then youth, and other issues we lump as one of those pillars. Now, with respect to the synergy, and yesterday I said I prefer to talk about complementarity instead of synergy. The Peace and Security Department and the Department of Political Affairs have collaborated successfully in undertaking 2 needs assessments, one to the Central African Republic in August 2016, of which when George Mukundi was head of the AGA, he was part of the team that constituted that. And the second one was the needs assessment to the Gambia in May this year, which was led by the former president of Burundi, President Pierre Buyoya. And what we have done following these 2 needs assessments, so it's not just only to assess, but then it's also to come up with a resource mobilization strategy in order to be able to provide support in the specific areas that we were requested to intervene. In the case of the Gambia, it was a request by the Gambian authorities to provide support following the transition in the Gambia in 3 areas. The first area was with respect to political dialogue and national reconciliation and justice. The second one was security sector reform, and the third one was economic revitalization. Now you'll start to wonder whether it is the AU's comparative advantage to revamp economies, but what we felt we could do was to listen to the Gambians and accompany them as they try to revitalize their economy. I think we have a fair degree of experience in doing the first and the second, political dialogue, reconciliation, security sector reform. As I speak to you, we are in the process of deploying a set of officers to support the Gambian authorities in security sector reform, rule of law, and transitional justice in the Gambia. And in order to manage all these processes at the level of the African Union, one of the innovative measures, and I call it innovative because I think it is one of those experiences where those of you who've worked in bureaucracies, you know that bureaucrats will smile at each other in the elevator, but they don't necessarily reach across when it comes to working together. So we have an interdepartmental task force that essentially brings together the entire departments in the African Union Commission, including and most importantly, the Bureau of the Chairperson. So these 2 initiatives that I talked about, the needs assessments to the Gambia and the one to Central Africa, were undertaken in the framework of the task force. Now, in practical terms, the Peace and Security Department, and this is the AGA-APSA complementarity, or if you want to call it synergy, we've contributed concretely to supporting the government of Sudan, and here I mean Khartoum, not South Sudan, in managing the political processes in that country. You recall that the African Union established what they call the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel, which is led by former President Thabo Mbeki. They supported the national dialogues in Sudan, and this has led to 2 successful elections in Sudan, in 2010 and in 2015. And in the same vein, we are also working with both Sudan and South Sudan to manage some of the issues that are still outstanding following the referendum in 2011. You recall that there are 3 areas that are still, the fate of those areas is yet to be determined as to whether they should be part of Sudan or they will be part of South Sudan. That is South Kordofan, AGA, and the Blue Nile. And I think here we work very closely with our colleagues from the Department of Political Affairs in managing this. The other area where we've worked very closely with our colleagues in the Department of Political Affairs is in South Sudan. You recall the agreement that was signed in August 2015 made provisions for transitional justice mechanisms, one of them being the establishment of a hybrid court for South Sudan. Now, what this essentially means is, as a Peace and Security Department, we have very little competence in terms of really when it comes to the legal issues involved in setting up a hybrid court. So we are working with the Department of Political Affairs and the Office of our Legal Counsel to work with the South Sudanese authorities to establish the hybrid court for South Sudan to deal with some of the serious crimes that were committed during the conflict in that country. In July this year, a team from the African Union led by our legal counsel was in Juba, where they've agreed on a roadmap for the establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan. Now, I wouldn't want to take too much of your time because there are 3 other speakers, but essentially just to say that in all these areas, I think for us what is extremely important is, as an African Union, we are trying and we are working towards delivering as one. And in this respect, I can say with some degree of modesty that we are making some progress, and yet there are some challenges. So I will just reflect on, I think, two key challenges that I think we need to, bear in mind. The first one is the Peace and Security Council, which is the primary legislative body when it comes to issues of peace and security on the continent. I think they deal with the issues of peace, security, and governance, not necessarily in a holistic way. I think there is some progress. They've made a lot of reports and pronouncements, but I think we still need to ensure that the spirit of what we have in the task force is also reflected in the work of our Peace and Security Council, which is, at the heart of the African Peace and Security Council. It is the nerve center, and it provides us with strategic guidance to take that forward. I think the second challenge is with respect to our relationships with the RECs. You are aware that there are proposed reforms, and in the part of the reforms is to devolve some of the responsibilities from the AU to the RECs. But in order to do that, I think we need to clearly define what the relationship will be with respect to who does what, at what point, and how that relationship will be governed going forward. So having said that, I will just come back by a way of conclusion to say the AGA and the APSA are indispensable tools in our efforts to silence the guns by 2020 and to move this continent in the direction of greater stability and development as we go into 2020, which for us, our marching orders are everything that you do will have to be geared towards achieving that end state. So I will leave it at that, and then when we get to the questions and answers, I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Barr. Dr. Barr, who's been working within PSD for quite some time and has in-depth experience, has given us an overview of the successes between AGA and APSA, but also the challenges that still lie ahead, and all focusing on achieving silencing the guns. Sergio, thank you very much for your input. We will now hand the floor to Dr. Linda Darkwa, who will speak on a very different note and looking at a different angle to the situation AGA-APSA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I think that following Dr. Barr's presentation, we are agreed that legally there is really no challenge between the AGA and the APSA, and that they are complementary. In fact, when you take a look at the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council, the Peace and Security Council is mandated, among other things, to undertake conflict prevention, management, and resolution. And what the AGA does for me is that the AGA provides the Peace and Security Council with the tools for conflict prevention. The APSA provides the PSC with the tools for conflict management, and then both the AGA and the APSA come back in to help the PSC with the resolution of conflicts. That's how I like to see it. So Dr. Barr said they were twins. Some say that they are two sides of the same coin. I even like to look at it as the same coin, not even two sides. If you need to buy water, you use your coin to buy water, and when you need it to buy food, you use it to buy food, essentially. Article 3 of the Act basically states that the objectives of the AU are to promote peace, security, and stability on the continent, promote democratic principles and institutions, popular participation and good governance, and promote and protect human and people's rights in accordance with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and other relevant human rights instruments. So again here, what I see the AGA doing is the last two. the promotion of democratic principles and institutions, the promotion and protection of human and people's rights. And the APSA comes in when there is a lack of compliance or a failure of compliance, which then results in insecurity. Essentially, then, what the APSA seeks to do is to create an enabling environment for the AGA to function effectively. Because usually what happens is we get to conflict when the elements of the AGA are not upheld, when we do not have popular participation, when there is no rule of law, when human rights are violated, then we get into conflict, and when that conflict is not properly managed, we can get into violent conflict. And when we do get into conflict, then the Peace and Security Council will deploy tools like the Panel of the Wise. And if that fails, then we hit crisis mode. And that is when we have Dr. Ba's unit coming in to manage the crisis. Now, once they manage the crisis and set the scene, it becomes long-term work. And long-term work cannot be done by an emergency tool. So then we revert back to the AGA. Because when you talk about transitional justice, when you talk about reconciliation, these are long-term things which you cannot do just with the peace and security architecture. But what is good is that even as you go on with the AGA, it is always good to know that you've got the APSA, which can always kick in again if things relapse. And so I like to look at the AGA and the APSA in these terms. I would then quickly like to move on to look at the linkages and synergies. What has already been done? I believe that the African Union has come a long way. There was a time when AGA and APSA were almost two distinct entities. But increasingly, what we see is that we have integrated planning at the African Union level, which means that you have people from the Peace and Security Department and people from the Department of Political Affairs sitting down and planning for peace support operations. This is good, but a lot can still be done. And a lot can still be done by ensuring that, one, the right people sit at the table at the right time. Oftentimes, what has been seen is that there is a sequencing of a sort. So if there is a crisis and we need to deploy troops, our focus tends to be ensuring that we are able to generate the right forces, and here the right forces tend to be the military, the police, and sometimes a bit of civilians. And their mandate essentially is to move in there and create stability. And then afterwards, when stability has been created, we move back, and then colleagues come in to help with planning for the transition and ensuring that all the other elements of the AGA are brought on board. And I believe that we need to move away from that. We need to move away from the sequencing to a time when we all sit together at the table right from the very beginning. It doesn't mean that you deploy everybody at the same time. But what it does is that it provides an opportunity to put all the issues on the table at the same time. And then you can sequence your deployment at a later period. But having a proper integrated planning right from the beginning, I believe, is absolutely critical. It's also important, and increasingly the African Union, right from its birth, has been deploying into high-intensity conflicts. And the military will tell you that we don't need civilians in the theater when we are engaged in high-intensity conflict. But yet, civilians have capabilities that the military doesn't possess. And when the military is busy trying to stabilize the situation, they do not have the time nor the resources to undertake some of the other activities that must accompany stabilization. For example, the delivery of humanitarian action, making sure that we provide basic needs for the people. And I think it was yesterday that I said this, when the African Union had its lessons learned on Somalia, one of the things that came out was the fact that the military, is able to fight, in the case of Somalia, Al-Shabaab, take possession of the territories that Al-Shabaab occupy, but then because they didn't have the police right with them from the very beginning, it meant that when they moved on, Al-Shabaab came right back and repossessed the territories that had been taken. And so they were essentially doing a dance, taking it, coming back to fight to take it. And if this had been part of the planning, that wouldn't have been the case. Again, there's also the issue that Somalis are saying when Al-Shabaab was here, they provided us with basic needs. Now the African Union is here, it's not providing us with the basic needs. And so ensuring that multidimensionality work effectively is absolutely critical to promoting the linkages and the synergies. Again, here, when we talk about the civilian role, we tend to focus a lot on humanitarian action, and I like to believe that is broader than that. If we cannot win wars with just military action. And so even as troops engage in combat, it's important for the political aspects to be done. And the political aspects are the work of, or the elements of the AGA. Negotiations, engagement, mediation, all of these, and not just with the actors in the conflict, but also with those outside of the conflict area. All of these are things that are best done by colleagues who work with the AGA. Then there is also the issue of having the capabilities, the skills, and also the resources to deliver the needs of the populations, the citizens. It is not enough to liberate a place and to provide some assistance or to pledge assistance that doesn't come early enough. And so again, whilst Peace Support Operations Division is the lead in making sure that there is military success, it falls back on to the Department of Political Affairs to ensure that the day-to-day bread-to-butter activities are effectively provided for. Yes, humanitarian action is part of peace support operations, but for an organization like the African Union that doesn't have a lot of resources, it helps to ensure that other colleagues are brought on board. There are a number of challenges. One is what I've just talked about, funding and skills. The African Union's operations are largely dependent on funding provided by external actors, unfortunately. And what that has meant is that sometimes donors have conditionalities. They tell you where the monies can go and what their monies can do and what the monies cannot do. And that creates a lot of challenges. Again, one of the essential things which now the African Union is doing better, but again, there is still room for improvement, is building the capacity of the host nations. No peace support operation will last forever. Even if it stays for 20 years, at some point it has to close and it has to leave. And it is only able to close and leave, or it should be able to close and leave, when local capacities have been developed. And again, this is where the APSA and AGA come in. When you go into a country where there hasn't been effective justice systems or institutions for the last 20 years, somebody has to rebuild the justice system. Somebody has to rebuild the public administration system. Somebody needs to work with the educational systems. That cannot be the APSA's job. That is the AGA's job. And when there is no proper complementarity and coherence, then again we go back to the sequencing that doesn't always help. One of the big challenges that the African Union, I believe, is confronted with, and those who work for the African Union will correct me if I'm wrong, is that the African Union, unlike the United Nations, deploys into situations where there is no peace to keep. And because there is no peace to keep, sometimes there are entities that are undesirable. We don't like their names. They are labeled either as terrorists, as violent extremists, etc. We've been in Somalia for 10 years. I'm not sure if we've won or if we are winning soon. So there comes a time when it becomes imperative for someone to sit and to reflect and to engage with these undesirable groups. I know that the African Union has a position, but I also do know that using the elements of the AGA, there can be ways around it. And so back to my earlier point of ensuring that everybody sits at the table so that the planning is done in a coherent and a comprehensive manner, allowing different actors to enter into the fray at the appropriate time, I think is absolutely critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda. Highlighting the point of joint integrating planning so that you can have a proper sequencing of activities and implementation. And then also the important role that AGA needs to fulfill in terms of good governance and state building in areas where there is none, such as Somalia. Well done, Dr. Darkwa. Thank you very much. We will now turn to Dr. George Mukundi and listen to his perspectives on AGA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annette, and a pleasure to be here at ISS. Thanks for the invitation, and obviously always useful to share a table with colleagues from the AU, from the REX, and also from think tanks, and for everybody who came to this meeting. As Annette said, I speak from the balcony, if one can use that analogy, in the sense that I was on the dance floor for 4 years, dancing to the tune and the music, trying to do some of the things that have been said ought to have been done in terms of trying to get the AGA operationalized, but also implementing the many ideas that we've just had from Linda, but also from Sergio. The African governance architecture, and I want to give a little bit of a background, came 10 years after APSA, if one can trace it that way, in the sense that APSA was constituted when they came up with the PSC protocol in 2002, when the OAU was being transformed into the African Union. And so one can perhaps begin to understand not just the time difference in terms of how those two architectures come in to be, but also the rationale and the reasons why they established those two particular mechanisms at different times. And we are more informed mostly by the circumstances under which the OAU was being transformed into the AU, in the sense that there was a concession by leaders, by Africans, by citizens, that the OAU was not necessarily delivering what it had been formulated to do, or it had significantly achieved the main goal, which was mostly liberation for Africans in terms of independence. And there was need now to shift focus. So from political gains and political independence, to begin then saying our people have not yet reaped the fruits of uhuru, or freedom. In two very useful terms is that socioeconomic and livelihoods were at the core of what Africans were keeping to argue they were not yet reaping, even as much as almost all countries by that time had become independent. And it's useful to then say, had they resolved the main challenges that they had set to do, which essentially around governance, peace and security, socioeconomic governance, but also broadly development. When APSA was formed, I think there was almost a thinking that peace and security remained one of the challenges to achieving all those particular issues. And that's why, without necessarily going back to what our colleague Sergio said, if you look at the strategic areas in which APSA has been set up, it was conflict prevention, crisis management, post-conflict construction and development in many countries, strategic security, but also coordinating and partnerships. And those are necessary in the sense that if one looks at whether countries that at this time were beginning to have significant challenges on peace and security from West Africa, if you think Liberia, Sierra Leone, and a couple of years after, countries like Rwanda, which had began consolidating their democracy after '94 with the Rwanda genocide, DRC, Central African Republic, and many others. The focus at the time, I think, within leaders was that if we consolidate peace and security, we'll be able then to achieve all the rest of the things. 10 years after, they still realized that, wait a minute, we are not yet there. What then seems to be the problem or the challenge? And it's in 2011, 2012, as the AU was almost beginning to want to celebrate 50 years after its formation, they asked, have we achieved these things? And they came to the consensus that perhaps there is a much bigger structural fundamental problem that we need to address, which is related to shared values. And there was always this debate that discussed what are those shared values. Is there something we share as Africans or as a people that want to go somewhere together? Or do we work in unity but also in dissonance? And increasingly, the AU then set up this summit that looked at what is it that they had achieved 50 years since the formation of the continental organization. And the concept of shared values, which I know we will be able to break down as we go along, focused a lot on the structural foundations for why, despite all the efforts that had been done by the OAU and the AU, we continued not to necessarily achieve sustainable development, continental integration, and peace and security. And those revolved the whole idea about democratic governance, broadly constituted, all understood and appreciated. And it looked at not just democracy from participating in elections, but people being able to participate, include, have a voice in terms of how they're governed. Increasingly also how they participated in their own governance structures through public service, through devolved government, through decentralization, but also how they were able to achieve the human rights, both political and civil, and also socioeconomic. Also, how countries were respecting constitutions, how they were respecting rule of law, because many countries realized that although they had constitutions on paper, what Okothogeda says constitutions without constitutionalism, is that yes, we have beautiful papers that essentially indicate that we have the rule of law, we have constitutions that are governing our countries, but the practice of constitutionalism, where the separation of powers, where even the leaders are also accountable, are also under the law, and many countries from the north to the south to the east, each one of us knows too very well that that doesn't necessarily, or was not always the case. And it is upon those then that they said, what are those shared values? And they looked at all the instruments, 16, 17, 18, and many more, that the AU itself, the regional economic communities had come up with, from the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Public Service Charter, to the Local Governance Charter, to the Anti-Corruption Convention, and many of the other instruments which perhaps for those ones who are students of politics but also history and law would know, including the Constitutive Act, extremely very, very useful norms and standards that the AU always comes up with to say these are the issues that should govern the way in which we relate with each other. But despite the institution that also was supposedly to facilitate implementation of those norms and standards, unfortunately, there was a gap. And there were three significant gaps. The first gap was that those shared values, as much as they existed on paper, not all of them were getting implemented at the national level. There was also another concession, that those gaps or those values are not necessarily owned, shared, and appreciated by the people who are supposed to benefit from those shared values. So a significant disconnect between what the leaders were articulating and espousing and what citizens on the ground, in communities, in schools, in public societies, were looking at the AU to be able to deliver the fruits of Uhuru. The third one was that they had established way too many institutions and instruments: the African Court, the African Commission, the Pan-African Parliament, the African Peer Review Mechanism, the AU Commission, all these task forces and departments within the AU Commission, and all of them supposedly to do and deliver all these fruits of Uhuru. But yet they seem to work in convergence in certain instances, but not always working concertedly towards the same goal. And what was the problem? That's the reason why then they said, can we then not establish a new institution, but establish a mechanism that asks these institutions to reflect and look upon those three key gaps: the disconnect between the people and the leaders, the number two, the ownership and the appreciation of those shared values among normal ordinary people, but also why it is that they continued working in disharmony, so that then they can have some level of convergence. And that's how the African governance architecture came about. So you will notice, unlike what Sergio said, this was not formulated through an instrument that is legally binding. It's a declaration through the AU Shared Values Summit in Addis that then said, let's set up an African mechanism that brings together all those institutions to be able then to deliver these issues, because unless we are addressing the structural reasons why in Africa we continue facing peace and security, lack of development, we are unlikely to get there. But we will not establish a new institution, because that's what the AU always was sent to be doing. Every time there's a crisis, every time there's a challenge, we set up a new institution. So we don't want to set up a new institution, so there's a new formal mechanism just to bring together people, just to bring people together to be able then to deliver. So a couple of challenges that I'll speak about by then not setting up a legally binding instrument to bring these actors together, and then saying it's an ad hoc informal mechanism that perhaps creates an incentive for actors that have specific mandates by their constituting instruments to be able then to work within the same things. So why was it necessary to set up? So I'll present, in very quickly, three ways in terms of how I approach what I have learned in the balcony moments, having then attempted, like I said, and looking at it reflectively, saying, what is it that we could have done better? Because I was the head of the Secretariat for 4 years. I retired last year in December. And I have spent this year really thinking, what is it when I was there I could have done? or I could have worked with the people, and what are the ideas that we were told many times by many actors, civil society, think tanks, ISS, and everybody who thought that, look, you can do better, AU can do better. And what Sergio and everybody admits and concedes are the key ways in which the AU needs to look at the way in which we do business. So 4 key things. The first one, and I know it's also one of the strategic areas that our brother Sergio said as the strategic pillars of APSA, is to say prevention is better than cure. And we all know that. But hardly do any of us often, especially when you are younger, often go to your doctor just because you're thinking, I want to know what might happen in a couple of areas. And I'm happy Yaki just came in because he's increasingly now looking at future scenarios mapping and forecasting the future. So very few of us want to know what the future looks like. We look always to the past and the present. And that hasn't necessarily worked because we've learned increasingly, and I think one of the differences and the way in which the AU then has said is that if we focus on conflict prevention, we are likely to see what happened just the other day in Zimbabwe. We are likely to see what might happen in many of the countries that we are, whether it's Cameroon, whether it's Togo, whether it's Congo. And I can, because I'm no longer working for the AU, mention a few countries because I think it's necessary for us to begin looking at particularly what are those places where we see, unless we are doing something now, we will get ourselves into trouble into the future. So they said we have to focus because we've invested way too many in PSOD, in conflict management, in post-conflict construction and development. But all that money and resources that we invest in those places, how about if we invested by going to the doctor, by looking at how we enhance those 5 key pillars of governance so that if we do that, there is a very good chance that we'll prevent conflict. So focusing and emphasizing on structural conflict prevention. The second area is that the AU realized through the global financial crisis that there is way very little more money coming into the picture. There is way less capacity, there is way less resources that is available for us to do the things that we've always done because the West and many of the others that had interest in these spaces are increasingly changing their tune and the things that they're thinking are necessary. But also that resource mobilization domestically wasn't being useful enough in terms of making sure that it's available to do conflict prevention. So another area of saying, let's do more with less, which means can we coordinate, ensure these organizations come together, work with the little that they have to do far more, because unless we are doing that, we ain't going to give them more resources. The third area was to say we have to shift focus. Because the AU and many of you who've written and understood how the AU works have always imagined that this is an institution that protects leaders, which is the reason why in Zimbabwe, if you ask why they did not want the citizens to hear SADC or the AU said, we know what these guys are going to craft. They'll try to protect the interests of those who are already in power. So we do not want that to happen. So Zimbabwe is teaching us a couple of lessons. And these are lessons that only not Zimbabwe is teaching us. Africans from Burkina Faso to North Africa to the Gambia. Everywhere we are learning that unless you're focusing our strategic areas of focus to citizens, we will get ourselves into significant trouble. So then saying we have to shift and give primacy of all our interventions to the beneficiaries of everything we do, and that's the citizen. That yes, leaders of course guide us and give us direction, but they do it on our behalf, not the other way around. The fourth area was that yes, we have all the institutions, mechanisms and institutions, but why is it that they're not implementing them at the domestic level? So how is it then that the AGA and the APSA have tried to do these things? I present 5 key things in the paper that you have to look at, but also that we have debated, and we debated yesterday quite concretely, is that we have to look at how at the first port of our engagement, and the AGA and the APSA have increasingly tried to do that, is reshaping and refocusing on citizens' engagement. So for most of us, or many of you who are observers of the AU, you realize that over the last couple of years, 3 or so, there has been a new citizens' engagement, a youth engagement strategy, a women engagement strategy, principles, the Livingstone formula, that then says that yes, we have not always facilitated, allowed citizens to be part and parcel of the way we include and ensure that they participate not only at the national level, but also on continental governance. So through the high-level dialogues that you've seen facilitated, but also reaping from social media and engagement. I know we are live streaming this particular session. One of the 4 core reasons, and I like institutions also beginning to say, very few of us will have the luxury to sit in such a beautiful room. Majority of our people are out there doing what they have to do because they have to fetch and fed for themselves and having a livelihood. So how many people will hear and learn about these discussions? The AU has also adopted that formula, live streaming its events, facilitating through social media, Twitters, Facebook, and the many other elements. And because increasingly people have a very short memory span, people don't want to spend their time reading huge books. And if you see even institutions like ISS, very, very small briefs, some of the ones that I've seen, AU increasingly is doing that. Before they would hide loads of information from huge publicity documents that you would not even know what they're talking about. But nowadays you're going to have to know what it is being done. AGA, APSA, that's one of the key strategic areas that I think they've revolutionized how the AU engages. The second one is what our brother Sergio said, conflict prevention. And this is big in the sense that how do we prevent conflict from the AU's perspective? There's what we've done increasingly, I think, a partnership between the AGA and APSA through the conflict structure vulnerability assessment. And the Ghana has just gone through one. The first time, unprecedented. And it's very related to what the African peer review mechanism does. African peer review mechanism is one of the AGA pillars. But what we learned from those mechanisms is that, yes, they go into the field, including here in South Africa, including in Kenya, and many other countries that are members of the APRM, come up with very important suggestions, recommendations, national action plans, but they never get implemented. Why? We ask those questions. So the focus is to say, yes, we are able to do audits. Yes, we are able to go and do assessments. But how do we make sure that we support member states, we support citizens to demand that the implementation of those norms and standards, but also whatever has come up from those assessments is getting implemented at the domestic level. The data points, the human rights issues that we realize in Gambia, in Zimbabwe, in the Congo, in Togo, we know through not be told by the AU that there is likelihood there will be a crisis. Because the first data point that there is a likelihood to be crisis is when human rights gets infringed upon. When people cannot be able to have the right to assemble, right to express themselves, right to even voice their concerns. When you tear gas people just because they're saying we don't like what we are seeing, those are the first data points that things are elephant. And if things are elephant, then you don't even need a mechanism that tells you there is an early warning. So how do we then turn those data points we pick from human rights violations, from just normal observations and engagement through social media, to hear the past and the voices of the people on what needs to be done? Our friend Sergio Loge mentioned the PCRD, and I was party and happy to have been deployed by Sergio to do the first, at least recently since you came into the picture, the post-conflict construction development on Central African Republic, and they've done another one in the Gambia, and they'll do many others. The reason is that as Africans, one of the key things I think we pride ourselves, apart from the very nice South African known philosophy of Ubuntu, is that we are our brothers' keepers. We ain't going to allow our brothers, when they are in trouble, to just continue being in trouble. So we'll help them reconstruct. But also we have to learn that we cannot just help them as AU when we don't have those resources. So there's work World Bank can do, there's work development companies and banks can do, but also what is it that we can do together? First, by analyzing and realizing what are their needs, what are the issues that are going to be done. So through AGA APSA, because one of the key focuses, like I said, is not peace necessarily through supporting the military to be able to ensure there is peace, is to say, how do we rebuild the nation? And you cannot rebuild the nation essentially by strengthening peace security reforms. Is to say, is the judiciary able to participate and transform society? Are people able to participate, not just through elections? Because we've learned increasingly, elections are not necessarily the way to ensure democracy. And increasingly, in fact, especially from a country like Kenya, even in Zimbabwe and many others, that we have to shift even how we understand democratization from a focus on elections alone. That the winner-takes-it-all model is increasingly failing. The AU is agreeing, and many other people are saying, look, unless we learn to share power, unless we begin understanding how even those minorities and those people who don't have numbers, tyranny of numbers, they can participate effectively in governance and in democratization processes, we are likely to go anywhere. What then am I proposing? I ask. And there are quite a couple, which I don't want to bore you with. The first one, and I think is the key, is the whole idea about leadership. And I know Yaki and many others have spoken about this issue as a significant problem that is facing this continent. And it's not leadership only at technical level, because one of the few things we've also learned is technical solutions do not address adaptive problems. Because adaptive problems require a complexity and multiplicity of how you analyze and understand And at the heart of it is political leadership. And it's political leadership not only at the national level, but also, obviously, it's extremely important at the local level where there's decentralized government and devolution, but also even at the AU from the AGA level leadership. That Sergio and I, who used to work within the Interdepartmental Task Force, will hardly disagree because as technicians, we know what needs to be done. But unless our political leaders also buy into that idea and then give us direction and insist on what has to be done, what we've said, and the problem with Africa is that we always assume through the egalitarian principle that no one should raise their hand, because if you raise your hand, you're showing as if you're more important than someone else. But we've learned from ECOWAS. When there is crisis, there has to be someone who exercises leadership. We've seen Nigeria, we've seen Senegal do that. Why is it that we can't do the same on many of the other issues that are facing this continent? Why can't we? So political leadership, political clarity on coherence, on clarity of the issues that have to be done is at the core of the solutions that we are making propositions for. The second one is that we have to seize the moment. Zimbabwe didn't just happen because of the 37 or plus years that Mugabe was running that country. Some eureka moment, something happened that had to require first internal ownership, not external actors. Which is the reason they are very resentful of anybody who comes to purport that we came to help you folks. Because they help themselves even if they used what we are now increasingly calling sanitized a coup. Sanitized coup, it's a coup, it's a coup. Sanitized in the sense that the AU also, because of its clout, legitimacy, and force, which you have to give a little bit credit, and I don't want to claim it on their behalf, is that nobody wanted to be seen to have done an unconstitutional change in government in that country. And that's also really telling that actually those things work. Maybe not forcibly, but that none of those folks who were leading that country wanted to be associated with an unconstitutional change in government. So they sat in, negotiated, mediated, whether internally or externally, whatever you call it, made significant sense. The third one, and I think the reason why I'm using that is to say currently Kagame and others have suggested that there has to be AU reforms. Internally on, everybody agrees that there's restructuring that has to happen within the AU. How do we then ensure that this synergy we are talking about at the political level, which I know Rahimat is going to talk about because he has also fantabulous propositions on the Peace and Security Council, which is in charge of these processes, taking a much more lead in bringing these two actors together, because it's not always been like that. The PSC has always been seen, because maybe of the history, why it is placed to be an APSA pillar. But it's also a significant element, an actor within the governance cluster. So how is it that the PSC emphasizes, focuses beyond just holding the usual sessions it does in Addis, to ask for leadership, to take charge, whether when they make a decision on Burundi, that they don't renege on what the people need and being always on the right side of history. And often that has been with the people. The last 2 points is on how we track progress. On this continent, we do way many things. And one of the few things we have to agree, and I like what Linda said, it's not that the AU has not been extremely useful and working hard. They have. But how do we tell they have been working hard? How do we tell they've made a significant impact and change in our lives, in the lives of our grandmothers in the villages? How can we be able to tell that, yes, indeed, from today we were at baseline level 1. Tomorrow there is a significant shift in terms of how democracy has been consolidated, in terms of how we've achieved human rights. We ought to do monitoring and evaluation through what think tanks and institutions are trying to do. And the biggest difficulty is from an outcome-based results framework. It's extremely difficult to determine the baselines and the indicators for changes in governance. Yes, we can tell we deployed 20,000 troops in number of 2 countries. How can we tell there has been a shift in terms of how we are consolidating democracy and governance in Africa? And that has to be a role not just for the AU, but AGA, APSA, but also how civil society, think tanks, academics, and partners help us get these things done. The last one, and I think it's the most important, and I know I put it at the end, although it's equally important, that's one of the reasons in which they phrased this particular conversation, is strengthening this synergy between AGA and APSA through coordination, through complementarity, and through a cooperation. Is that it's not that they do not know that it's necessary and important to do that, but they're going to have to create incentives for actors that have specific mandates, institutions that have not necessarily always worked together, to find value in working together. That requires, number one, some bit of massaging a few egos, some bit of massaging a few people's ideas of how important they are, but also an ability to institutionalize these arrangements. That yes, it's nice when Sergio and I are working together. It's nice when the Director for Political Affairs, the Director for Peace and Security, and the Director even of all the various AGA platform members agree and can call each other to say, yes, let's have a meeting to discuss what has to be done. But unless that process is institutionalized, either of them leaves or either of them changes their mind, then we get ourselves into trouble. Thank you, Annette.
Thank you very much, George. It is very clear to us that, as you mentioned in the beginning, that you spent this year thinking about your 4 years as this head of AGA. It shows, and in your report it also shows. I want to highlight one or two aspects of what you have said. And the whole issue of the importance in terms of good governance of the role of the citizen, and that is not recognized, and that leaders are not in touch with the needs of the citizens, or they are not interested. And also in youth organizations such as your own, that on the technical level there's agreement, and then when you come to the commissioner level there's not agreement, and it makes it very difficult. I'm glad you raised the issue of conflict prevention. As we all know, the new, this year's appointed United Nations Secretary General made this a key issue. And yes, looking into the future, and as we discussed yesterday, this is a type of work that Jackie and them do. We need to use these forecasts and predictions, and we linked it to the early warning mechanism system to see what is coming so that we can address it. I want to say that I agree with you that if you work in the AU, AGA, APSA, that on your levels there is good cooperation and collaboration. There's a common vision. AGA came 2011, APSA 2002, 2003. The structures were there, and the structures prevent us, to a great extent, to fulfill our joint common vision. And I will stop by making a last comment, and that is also what people who do not work with or in the AU do not see are, for instance, the joint efforts between AGA and APSA going to Central African Republic and going to the Gambia. There's also room for improvement of marketing the success stories of the AGA-APSA collaboration. Thank you very much, George. On this note, we will give the floor to Rahimat, who has been for the last 9 years the ECOWAS liaison officer at the AU, and will give us a completely different view. And Rahimat, we are extremely glad that on short notice you agreed to deliver your presentation, and I trust that we will all find this a very refreshing presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. I'm going to be very practical, so I'm not going to talk too much theory. I'm supposed to be speaking on the role of the REX in enhancing AGA-APSA synergy. First, I'm speaking as Rahimat and not as an ECOWAS representative. I think I should make that very clear. Secondly, like Annette said, I've been working with APSA, because I started, as soon as I got to Addis Ababa, we started working on the APSA for 9 years. So I think I know the animal called APSA. And for AGA, I started working with AGA even before AGA was born, because we were part of those who pushed for the development of AGA. So in a way, I think I know both AGA and APSA very well. And it's from that position that I'm going to make my presentations and end up with some recommendations. First and foremost, and most importantly for me, the talk about AGA and APSA shouldn't be about AGA and APSA actually. It should actually be about how Africa can always take the driver's seat in resolving its security challenges and maintaining political stability, built on good governance, and not about departmental structure of the AUC or AGA or APSA. The only body, I'm sure all of us will know that, the only body charged with the responsibility to maintain peace and security and ensure political stability in Africa is the AU Peace and Security Council. It is the highest decision-making body in Africa, responsible for preventing conflicts, maintaining peace and security, and sustaining political stability. Its mandate is very clear in the protocol establishing it. And I'm just going to go to Article 3 that captures the objectives, because it appears that we need to remind ourselves now and again about because we just think Peace and Security Council and then we form different opinions about what that body should be doing. But let's go to the legal text that really states what the body should be doing. It says, the objectives for which the PSC is established shall be A, promote peace, security, and stability in Africa in order to guarantee the protection and preservation of life and property, the well-being of the African people and their environment, as well as the creation of conditions conducive to sustainable development. Objective B talks about conflict management, undertaking peacemaking and peace-building functions for the resolution of conflicts. C talks about peace building and peace security to consolidate peace and prevent resurgence of violence. D talks about prevention and combating terrorism. E talks about common African defense policy. And then lastly, the Peace and Security Council is supposed to promote and encourage democratic practices, good governance, and the rule of law, protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, respect for the sanctity of human life, and international humanitarian law as part of efforts for preventing conflict. But usually we think about the Peace and Security Council as just reactive, reacting to conflict, reacting to signs of conflict. But if you look clearly at this objective, for me, the main role of the Peace and Security Council is actually to prevent conflict and deepen democracy and ensure good governance. So that's my point of departure. I think it's as a result of different definitions or interpretation that we begin to see, a lot of people assume the Peace and Security Council should be doing what it should be doing. In the protocol, the understanding of peace and security is premised on the broader notion or scope of prevention, promotion, maintenance, and sustenance of peace, rather than the narrow understanding and scope of managing conflict, which, by the way, is the main focus of the APSA. The conflict prevention elements of the APSA roadmap, which I must say was jointly developed by the REX and the AU. This was the first time we had such a strong collaboration, so it's owned by the AU and the REX, the roadmap. So the conflict prevention elements of the APSA roadmap, and I think Dr. Oba had already said that, is under the strategic priority 1, which is conflict prevention. And in this case, we talk mainly about early warning and preventive diplomacy. And attached to this strategic priority, the main tools available to deliver on this priority is the continental early warning and the panel of the WISE. But on the other hand, the spirit of AGA, through its coordination platform, is to promote and ensure coordinated actions of all political and governance institutions, agencies, stakeholders towards preventing, promoting, and sustaining peace and stability by developing, deepening, and defending good governance values, institutions, and securing good governance dividends for the African people. This is my understanding of what AGA should be doing. So it is not a matter, for me, it is not a matter of the nexus, the synergy, the complementarity between AGA and APSA, but a merging of the two instruments to form one framework, which will serve to advise and support the Peace and Security Council to deliver on its 6 objectives. So we shouldn't be talking about who is working with AGA, where AGA is, where APSA is, but we should be talking about how do we get a tool, a main tool that is available to the Peace and Security Council to do its work, because that, for me, is the essence of all our discussion on the AGA and APSA. Like Dr. Sajo said, the main focus and goal is silencing the guns by 2020 or beyond. Yes, it's ambitious, but at least by 2020, we should be able to evaluate ourselves, like Dr. George said, track our progress. Even if we've not silenced the gun, we should be at least convincing the minds of not using the guns before they get silenced. Thus, this political and strategic gap in the definition and conceptualization, and by extension the implementation of both AGA and APSA, which were aligned to the AU departmental structure, amounts to wastage of scarce resources in terms of time, material, finance, human and political capital, and greatly undermines the aims and objectives of establishing the AU Peace and Security Council in the first place. That's my personal view. For me, the question is, why should the Peace and Security Council have 2 separate instruments to deliver on its mandate? The 6 mandates were not separate, they were together. So why should we now have 2 separate instruments under the charge of 2 different departments and directors, further confusing the Peace and Security Council? I think we need to merge the 2. So why should Peace and Security have 2 separate instruments to deliver on its mandate? Of course, perhaps the reason of this divided focus and framework is because the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council came after the Peace and Security Council Department and the Department of Political Affairs structure. The structures were already there, the 2 departments were there. Ideally, it's the text that should have determined the implementing structure, not vice versa. It should have been the text establishing the Peace and Security Council that should have said, okay, this is our mandate, and this is the structure, this is the text that will help us do the mandate. But now, because the structures were there, at that time, it was like, okay, it was more convenient. APSA, being that the Peace and Security Secretariat was hosted by the Department of Peace and Security, it was kind of convenient for them to, align it to the peace and security elements of the Peace and Security Council mandate, rather than looking at the broader mandate of the peace and security. So it's not too late, especially now that we have an opportunity for AU reforms. Before I go to my recommendation, let me share the ECOWAS experience, especially for those who are not too aware of the what is happening in ECOWAS or the ECOWAS structure. In the ECOWAS case, we call our organ the Mediation and Security Council, because we lay a lot of emphasis on mediation for prevention, mediation for management, and even mediation post-conflict. So we call it the Mediation and Security Council. And like the AU Peace and Security Council, we have it at the ambassadorial, ministerial, and the heads of state level. Unlike the AU Peace and Security Council, the Mediation and Security Council of the ECOWAS is most active at the level of the heads of states. And I'm sure that's one of the success factors, critical factors for ECOWAS success. So I give an example, in the case of Mali, there was a coup in Mali in March 2012. Within about 2 months, the ECOWAS heads of state, as the Mediation and Security Council, held up to 8 summits at the heads of state level, most times holding summits in the VIP wing of the Abuja airport, just to show you the level of rapidity, the level of fluidity and flexibility when it comes to peace and security in ECOWAS. It's taken at the highest level. So we have that difference with the AU. At the ECOWAS Mediation and Security Council is non-resident or permanent like the Peace and Security Council. We don't have ambassadors sitting in Abuja meeting every two hours or two days, because when there is a conflict and we think it goes straight either to the ministerial level or to the heads of state level. So that's, in my view, I force us to always have direct contact with our member states' capital, not with any intermediary in Abuja, straight to the capital. In the text, the ECOWAS Mediation and Security Council, it was supposed to be 9 out of 15 members, but in practice, we all have 15 member states, making up a Mediation and Security Council, because I understand before I even joined ECOWAS that the member states said no, peace and security is too important for us to live to 9 out of 15. We all want to be on the table at the same time so that we take and own our decisions and our processes. So at the level of the ECOWAS Mediation and Security Council architecture, the political level, you have the authority of heads of states, then you have the ministerial, and you have the ambassadorial level. In the case of our ambassadors in the Mediation and Security Council, we have quarterly meetings with them. That's the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security. The Commissioner hosts quarterly meeting with our ambassadors for briefing, exchange of information, and discussing issue. By the way, if it is not very obvious, in the case of ECOWAS, we have both political affairs and peace and security under one department, under the charge of one commissioner. So it is called Department of Political Affairs and Peace and Security. So that's another difference we have, with what is different from between ECOWAS and the AU. In terms of the operational structure of our Mediation and Security Council, we have the President of the Commission at the head. Then we have the Commissioner of Political Affairs, Peace and Security as next. And then under her, because I'm happy that it's a her that is the Commissioner, so it's not often you talk about hers in such positions, so I'm happy to be saying it's a her. So under her, we have the Peace Fund. I'm sure you know that we established our Peace Fund way long ago. So we have a Peace Fund that is functional, and that's why we are hoping that the AU Peace Fund will also become more functional so that we can build synergies. Then she also works directly with the ECOWAS President, special and permanent representatives to member states. We often set up, deploy special representative to countries that are under conflict or post-conflict. But right now we have in 8 countries. We have in Togo, the Gambia, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And of course, she also works with my office. I have dual reporting line, so the ECOWAS liaison office to AU. And then lastly, we have a finance cell under her, and that was initially established and supported by the AU towards financial management of AFISMA, the joint deployment mission we had with AU in Mali. So under her, we have 3 directorates: the Directorate of Early Warning, which is currently establishing national early warning mechanisms and response systems. We have the Directorate of Political Affairs. That's why we have our very famous ECOWAS Council of the Wise. It's under the Political Affairs Directorate. And then we have the Directorate of Peacekeeping and Regional Security that oversees the ECOWAS Community Chief of Defense Staff. The West African, WAPCO is West African Police Committee, and other security mechanisms under the Directorate for Peacekeeping and Regional Security. And of course, the main 2 under this directorate, managed by this directorate, is the ECOWAS Standby Force. So in the case of ECOWAS, you could say we have a coordinated structure with one text. We have a main text, which is the Protocol of Democracy and Good Governance. And then we have a mechanism, a text about a mechanism. So we, more or less, we have a structured, a coordinated structure. But yet, in my view, internal coordination is not at its optimal. So if in the case of ECOWAS, with one structure and all that, internal coordination still requires improvement, then how do we expect 2 departments under 2 different commissioners at the African Union, no matter how well they build synergies, no matter how many interdepartmental task forces, it can't happen. We need to be very realistic about that. So under the ECOWAS PAPS Directorate, this is the substructure. I don't think I need to go into that. It's on the slide. So I'll go to the main question that was asked was, how can REX enhance AGA-APSA synergy? And I laugh because it's like asking children to bring feuding parents together. But it can be done, especially with very ambitious children of these days. They have a way of manipulating the parents, so maybe that's what we'll do. First, I think one of the ways of doing that is by sharing their own experiences. I'm talking REX in this case, in terms of the text, structure, and activities like what I've just done with both AGA and APSA. Secondly, to engage with AGA and APSA in a coordinated manner, not falling into the PSD, DPA structural divide, because most of the RECs don't have that divide. Our structures are more coordinated. And in that case, it means that I'm dealing with AGA as an ECOWAS representative, I'm dealing with APSA. So there's no division, it's the same person. So I think that's what the rest should continue to do. Use the same set of people to deal with both instruments, pending when I hope they will be merged. So, and I also think it's very important for the rest not to exploit this departmental divide at the AU, otherwise Africa will be the loser. And very importantly for me, not because that ECOWAS seemed to have found the master stroke of being able to fund his own activity, because that was one of the things that impressed me when I joined ECOWAS in 2008. I realized that the community levy was a master stroke, and one must congratulate the member states. So you have a situation, let me speak of the 9 years I've been in ECOWAS. I just went for a budget defense session in Abuja. Our annual budget, since I joined ECOWAS, always has between 8 to 12% of external funding. All other things we do is ECOWAS resources. And even the 8 to 12%, we usually don't use up to 20% at the end of the year. It goes to show you that you need, as REX and AU, we need to fund our activities. We need to fund our activities. We can't run away from that, especially when it comes to governance issues. Because member states will tell you governance issues are sensitive. So fund it yourself. If they are sensitive, fund it yourself. But right now, we have partners funding most of the activities in AGA. So my first proposal, I'm sure I will make more enemies now. My first proposal and recommendation is to merge the AGA and APSA to one framework. I just use the super framework just to make it look a bit, it's not going to be super, it's just going to be a framework. In the text and architecture. And that is regardless of the DPA and PSD divide. Yesterday, a UN colleague was telling us about the possibility of merging, similar structures at the UN. So I'm not even bold enough to say merge two departments. I am just saying merge two instruments so that the two departments can deliver together and as one. Not the departments, but the instruments. So for me, the proposed name for this merger framework will be African Governance and Political Stability Architecture. So you're not going to lose any sleep. You just pronounce a G. Instead of the APSA, you put a G in between, APSA. It's not so difficult. Why? Why am I proposing this? Because interdepartmental coordination, in my view, will not produce the needed synergies, no matter how friendly the head of the Secretariat of AGA or the directors of political affairs and directors of peace and security. My 9 years experience in Addis Ababa shows that that cannot happen. When, as part of the ongoing AU reforms, for me, I see the AU reforms as a very huge opportunity. I don't know when we will be bold enough to talk about reform of the AU. So we need to seize the moment. I think it was Dr. George that said, we need to seize the moment. If your political leadership, by stroke of any luck, is self-reflecting and telling you that we need to reform, then we need to help them to reform and not to twerk. Why are we twerking? Why are we afraid to reform? Reform means change, shape, reshape. So for me, this is a good opportunity as part of the ongoing AU reforms. How? Because that will be the question everybody will ask. For me, the Peace and Security Council should remain the pillar of APSA, and the APSA should adopt the AGA clusters. I think the AGA clusters, I'll show you a diagram later, should adopt the AGA clusters, or if you call them thematic groupings, but include conflict management, because that's the main aim of the APSA. And that this new framework should also adapt the APSA strategic priorities and mechanism. The priorities, Dr. Ba already told us, conflict prevention, conflict management, post-conflict reconstruction, strategic security issues, coordination and partnership. So you adopt that. And then, of course, all the other APSA, the former, okay, still APSA mechanism, like Continental Early Warning, Panel of the Wise, and Peace Fund will be shared between the AGA and APSA, now renamed to APSA. Of course, this will imply one roadmap and a harmonized structure. So you don't have, regardless of where you are sitting, whether you are sitting in the Political Affairs Department or Peace and Security Department, it doesn't matter. You have one roadmap, you have an harmonized structure in the sense that you know what you are doing, you can see yourself in the roadmap, and you will deliver together. And then for me, very importantly, there should be an expanded Peace and Security Council Secretariat and a resource center. Right now, what we have is a secretariat with few contract staff. There is no resource base, there is no research informing decisions at the Peace and Security Council. So we need to have an expanded secretariat, a combination of the current secretariat of the Peace and Security Council and the AGA secretariat should come together so that we have a resource center that has research capacity and library. And I think there's a mistake in the right-hand side when it comes to the combined secretariat. It's not secretariat of APSA. APSA doesn't have a secretariat, but PAC will correct that later. So this is what I am saying as the combined framework. You can see that at the bottom you have, at the clusters I was talking about that we should adopt from AGA, you have governance, democracy, human rights and transitional justice. You have constitutionalism, should be constitutionalism and rule of law, humanitarian affairs, and of course, the new one, conflict management, and that is where PSOD and the ASF will come under. I've also, like I said, there should be a common roadmap, adopting the 5 strategic priorities, and then they should have shared mechanisms. And you can see that the AU chairperson is under the Peace and Security Council. I'm proposing that the Secretariat, the Peace and Security Council Secretariat, or the Peace and Security should be hosted at the AU, centrally at the office of the AU chairperson. Then for me, these are some of the operational implications and quick wins that we will get if we merge the framework. First, we have an expanded coordination platform and meetings, including the annual high-level dialogue. As we speak, the high-level dialogue of the Department of Peace and Security took place in, is it Uganda? Jamina a week ago. And then next week, I'm coming back to Pretoria to attend the same high-level dialogue of the Department of Political Affairs. So we have to combine these meetings, these processes, and these activities that we do, since we are tools. When I say we, AGA and APSA, are tools in the hands of the Peace and Security Council. So there shouldn't be difference. Of course, you have a common roadmap. You have joint needs assessments, analysis and assessment, which, as we are told, already started. Shared knowledge management. I must admit that the AGA, as short-lived as it is, it's a very young baby, is very good in knowledge management. So that will be an added value that AGA is bringing on board. For APSA, we are so used to dealing with ourselves, we assume that everybody knows APSA. I used to joke that APSA seems to be more popular in Brussels than in the capitals of Africa. I hope it's different now. Then, one gain immediately will be shared expertise. There's a lot of expertise capacities that have been built in AGA, and especially APSA, because we've been operating APSA for almost 10 years. So we should be able to share and exchange those expertise. There should be joint resource mobilization. And for me, very important is equal access to the AU Peace Fund. When I say equal access, I'm not saying the AU Peace Fund should sit down and say, AGA, take, APSA, take. No, you should, the governance activities should be able to be funded under the Peace Fund. Because when you hear Peace Fund, people just think it has to be peace missions. Peace. You can't have peace without good governance. So there should be that equal access to the AU Peace Fund. And then for me, I don't believe in M&E. We say a lot of M&E. If there is no accountability after the M&E, to me, it's just paperwork. So there should be joint monitoring, evaluation, and accountability to the people, not to ourselves, not to our donors, to the people. And that will include reporting and feedback. What we have right now, which to me is a wasted opportunity, at every AU summit, you have each commissioner talk to the press. Why would Commissioner of Department of Political Affairs talk separately from Department of Peace and Security? If there's that joint reporting and accountability, it makes it easier for Africans to appreciate what the AU is doing. So the added value for me, exchange of added value, if they are merged, is the fact that AGA works very well with other AU organs, the court, the parliament, the commission, Human Rights Commission, and all that, and works also with the RECs. They are also very great in citizens' engagement and knowledge management. And part of that knowledge management, as George was talking about, is to popularize the shared values. We need to popularize our shared values so that every African on the street, if they say, what are the African shared value, or you say African Union shared value, you can say 1, 2, 3, 4. But right now, I'm sure if you ask anybody, in fact, sometimes if you ask people working in the organization, they may not know the shared value. So we need to popularize that. And what APSA will be bringing on board is APSA works very well, has worked very well with the RECs, and great capacities and expertise have been built over a long period of time, like I've said. So that will come on board. My second proposal and recommendation is to rename the AU Peace and Security Council to be called AU Political Stability Council. This, we have already made a recommendation to the AU Reform Unit. When I say we, the RECs liaison officers. So it was a collective effort. So it still remains Peace and Security Council. Nothing major has changed. Why? Why am I saying this? To reflect the totality of its objectives and change the dominant mindset that the Peace and Security Council is not fit for the purpose of addressing governance deficits, and that we can silence the guns without addressing the root causes of conflict and insecurity. Because that's the sense you get. When you talk to member states and you call governance, before you say deficit, they are defensive. Oh, no. But you cannot. There is no shortcut to political stability. You have to do the right things. So we need to disabuse the mind of people, and especially members of the Peace and Security Council, that their main responsibility is to promote good governance and to be able to prevent a conflict. That message must come out very clear. When, again, as part of the ongoing AU reforms, there's no better time for us to shake things up if we are really serious. How? Like I said before, hosting of the new Peace and Security Council Secretariat, or the Peace and Security Council in the office of the AU chairperson, giving its central role, responsibility, and contribution to the purpose and mandate of the AU. And of course, to enhance access to all AU departments, other AU organs, and non-AU stakeholders. Again, establishment of the expanded Secretariat and Resource Center, and then establishment of an AU Peace and Security Council pool fund. Now I'm going to be very unpopular. I believe that to be a member of the AU Peace and Security Council, for any AU member state, whether the big fives, it's a privilege. And if it's a privilege, put your money where your mouth is. You can't just come and become a member of the Peace and Security Council, contributing nothing. Then you have so you don't have a dedicated resource base to do certain activities. You want to go on mission, you have to wait for the benevolence of maybe the country chairing the Peace and Security of that month to take you for a retreat in Namibia or Abuja. No, there should be some dedicated funds available for you to. You may need to go to Zimbabwe when things were happening. No money to make that quick move. I don't want to recall the history of how we didn't do well in the case of Libya. That's a matter for another day. So I believe that there should be a Peace and Security Council pool fund that will come from mainly the members. They change membership every two years. There's going to be a set of new members in January. So as they come, they should be able to put something down to show their commitment. And also, this is very important for me too, there should be structured and sustained capacity building for members of the Peace and Security Council, off and online. These days it's easy to manage, to share knowledge. You have a situation that, like I said, January there'll be new Peace and Security Council member states. We need to build their capacity, we need to resource them, then they need to be provided information, because one thing that I don't know if this will be very bad, I'm almost done, is the fact that working in Addis Ababa, you get the impression that some countries, or sometimes countries, don't send their best diplomats to Addis Ababa, but they should. For me, that should be where they send their best diplomats. Yes, send your best diplomats as well to the UN, to Geneva, to Brussels, because of the multilateral environment there. But very importantly, your best diplomats should be sent to Addis Ababa. So lastly, my last take. The AU cannot be made fit for purpose unless and until the AU Peace and Security Council is made and resourced to be fit for its own purpose. And this is because its purpose is central to the capacity, effectiveness, added value, and integrity of the AU. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rahimat. It is obvious that as liaison officer for ECOWAS, that you have been studying and following and working on with these instruments at the AU for a long time, and it's refreshing to see how some of the RECs do their own business, and there's room for adaptation. But I want to bring us just back before I make a last comment, and that is, George mentioned it and we all know it, the critical importance of getting the buy-in from our leaders and the political will to make the changes that are required. If we can't do that, we can have ambitious proposals and the changes will not occur. And that work also starts at the technical level to ensure that our political leaders are well informed about issues like AGA APSA. I want to thank all the speakers, and before we say goodbye to our online participants, let's just give the speakers a round of applause.